Good afternoon to you, and welcome back here to Grace Lutheran Church as we continue our Bible study here on Paul the Apostle. I'm Pastor Stecker, and today we're looking at chapter 3, which is Damascus, or Paul's conversion. Happy Tuesday. A blinding light from heaven, and the persecutor becomes the preacher. The question, what transformed the zealous persecutor into the zealous apostle? But before we move forward, let's glance briefly backwards to last Thursday's video, which set the stage for today. Remember, we are encountering a dedicated and zealous first-century Jew whose whole mission in life was to stay loyal to the one true God. This unwavering perceived loyalty is what produced the zealous spirit which allowed him to watch over the stoning of Stephen. It also propelled him forward to continue to find and stamp out Jesus' followers, who were in his mind convincing Jews and Gentiles alike to abandon the ancient Israel way of life and their God. In his mind, this group, Christians, were preaching against loyalty and for corruption, abandonment, and at best, apathy. This is the man we find journeying to Damascus on that fateful day. But before we move on, I want to talk briefly about how the historical study of the life of Paul, and specifically his conversion, is conducted. Now, this is important because outside of Jesus, Paul has received the most literature and papers written about his life. And for good reason. His writings are unarguably one of the most influential writings in human history. And when it comes to his conversion, there's a wide range of opinions and perspectives out there. Some good, some okay, some not so much. The book we are following, N.T. Wright's biography on Paul, is written by someone who's not only a well-respected historian and Christian, but considered one of the experts in the field, and specifically on Israel's history and their first century understanding. In his book, he rightly speaks out against one modern trend in attempting to understand Paul, and that is psychology. In other words, people will often try and look back and attempt to psychoanalyze Paul as an explanation for his conversion. Wright points out that historical psychology may be an amusing armchair sport, but it's next to useless in real historical investigation. Now, I point this out to you for two reasons. First, because today more than ever in history, there's an overabundance of writings and opinions out there that you can find. Opinions such as Saul's vision was really the moment when his twice-born personality kicked in. Or it was residual guilt of Stephen's stoning that came back and haunted him. Or it was the psychological result of a young man with a lustful heart who was trying to abide by the strict moral demands of his culture, etc., etc. The list goes on. In other words, not everything that is written on Paul is really grounded in history or in the Bible and should be taken seriously. This brings us to the second reason I bring this up. While these approaches are in themselves conjecture, they are also dangerous because they muddy the waters and they take our focus away from what's really going on in his conversion. The story of Saul's conversion is not primarily about a man overcoming a guilty past, nor about a young man being emancipated from cultural demands of discipline and holiness. The conversion is about something much deeper and more important than that. So once again, to understand Saul's conversion, we need to dive a little deeper into what he believed and what motivated him. And to understand these things is not psychology, but history. We understand what shaped Paul by understanding what shaped all dedicated first-century Jews. And by understanding this, we can better understand what happened on that fateful day when Saul rode to Damascus. The big question for us to answer today is this: what happened that made Saul's zeal for the Torah and the laws of Judaism suddenly emerge in a different form as zeal for what Paul called the good news or the gospel, the message about Jesus as the fulfillment of all things. This is the basis for what Paul's conversion was. It wasn't that he believed one narrative and then replaced it with a completely different narrative. It wasn't that he had one set of beliefs and then turned from those beliefs to something completely new. Instead, Paul the Apostle saw himself as keeping the same narrative of beliefs, but seeing it in a new light and in a new way. And the narrative we are talking about was the hope of Israel. And this word, hope, is an important word for us. We hear Paul speak about hope often in his epistle writings. For instance, in Romans 8, Paul says, "For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have?" When Paul talks about hope, it's not a feeling, nor is it mere optimism. Paul's understanding of Israel's hope is a virtue. It's something that you practice, like an instrument or a sport. It would be part of his daily and his weekly routines, to recount, remember, and meditate on the unshakable promises that God has made to him and his people. This would have been a fundamental practice that he saw would have carried out on a regular basis, recounting the promises of the prophets of old, reading the Psalms to rekindle the hope that the Jews were supposed to have. This hope was rooted in the entire Old Testament story. It began with Adam and Eve, who didn't do their job in the garden, listening to the serpent. And so God exiled them to a world of thorns and thistles, and continued all the way up until they worshipped false idols and were then taken into Babylonian captivity. The story of Israel had been one of a rescue operation, how God was going to rescue humankind and restore his creation. In many ways, Israel's story begins with Abraham, where God makes a covenant promise with him that through his offspring, the world would be put right. However, there was unavoidable stains in their history. Israel's covenant unfaithfulness, the people who were supposed to be God's light in the world, continually rejected God and embraced the darkness. Wright paints this predicament in this way. But what if the rescue operation, Abraham's family, was itself in need of rescue? What then? If the lifeboat gets stuck on the rocks, who will come to help and how? See, this was the newfound predicament in Saul's day. He, along with his fellow Jews, understood that it was their job to remember the covenants that God had made with them, the covenants to rescue the world through them. They were supposed to have hope, but on top of this, they also understood that they themselves had been part of the world's problem, meaning they not only had to be rescued, but forgiven. This was the message of the prophets: hope for rescue, both from exile and from their sins. But the question was, what would this look like? Now, before we move on, I want us to pause and try to look at the world through Saul's eyes. Here is a man who would have continually recited and recounted day and night his ancestral history, remembering God's promises, remembering the heroes of old, and the sins of his forefathers. And all of this shaped in him a zealous yearning for hope. Hope that God was going to soon, maybe even in his lifetime, bring these things to completion through the coming of a Messiah. He would have wrestled continually with the vision, trying to make sense of how it would all come together. But before we see how it does come together, we need to unpack one more essential component to the Jewish understanding of hope. There's something essential to Israel's history, which may seem a little foreign to us, and that is the temple. Now, the reason this is foreign to us is because we, as 21st century Christians, live in a world shaped by Christianity. Our entire Western world has been shaped by these beliefs and practices for 2,000 years. So for us, it is built into our understanding that God is with us at all times. We may gather together at church, and certainly we believe that God comes to us in a very intimate way in the sacrament. But the Jewish understanding of the temple was a little more pervasive. The story of the temple goes back to the Ark of the Covenant, where God promises the newly emancipated Jews that he would dwell in the Ark of the Covenant. God didn't mince his words, and he wasn't speaking of metaphors. He said that he would dwell in a specific place, and that worship and sacrifices were to be done in a way that was built around his dwelling in the Ark of the Covenant. Years later, God's presence moved to the great temple built by Solomon. This was an essential part of Israel's worship life. The temple was the heart of their nation. The temple was understood as the place built to hold together the divine realm of heaven and the human realm of earth. It was in a way the new Garden of Eden, and the artwork around both the Ark of the Covenant and the temple exemplified and taught this understanding. Now, this is important because for the Jewish people, the temple was essential to their identity as a nation and their relationship with Yahweh. And for good reason, because this, the temple worship, was directed by God. Now remember, in an earlier lesson, where we said that religion for these ancient people was not something separate from the rest of their lives. The temple would be a perfect example of this. The temple wasn't just one part of the community like, say, a church in Nashua. It was the central part of the entire nation. Their religious life was the most crucial and central part of the entire Jewish life and culture. Now here's why this is so important. When the Jews were exiled to Babylon for the continual worship of false idols and their rejection of Yahweh, God abandoned the temple. This was of monumental consequence. It symbolized, but then again more than symbolized, God's connection with and indwelling with his people. But prophet after prophet foretold a new temple. For instance, do you remember the famous prophecy from Isaiah in Isaiah 40? The one that Matthew tells us is a foretelling of John the Baptist. A voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, and rugged places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed. And all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. See, the Israelites there in exile rightly understood this prophecy, along with others, as referring specifically to the temple. A new temple that would appear, and the divine glory of God that would again dwell with the people. The God of creation, again bringing peace and prosperity and justice. Now, it's important to note that technically the temple had been rebuilt after the Jews returned home from their Babylonian captivity, well after the prophet Isaiah. However, the temple had never again regained its prior prominence. We don't have the time to fully unpack this, but for now it will suffice to say that Israel was still awaiting a renewal of the temple, or for some, a whole new temple which recaptured the glory and divinity of old. This anticipation of a renewed temple was on the forefront of Saul's mind. It was part of his daily and weekly discipline of hope, thinking and meditating on these things. But how would he help prepare the way? How would he help make straight the paths? Well, for starters, he would follow the Torah, the laws of the people. He would also pray, fast, and strictly observe all of the rules and rituals of his people's heritage. And he would zealously defend Israel from those trying to corrupt it. All of this was what shaped young Saul as he journeyed to Damascus on that fateful day. But Saul's understanding of hope and his understanding of the temple was about to suddenly make sense in a whole new and unlooked-for way. Now, one part of Jewish life, which we haven't fully talked about yet, is fasting, prayer, and meditation. One important part of Saul's life would have been meditating on these hopes in a zealous and disciplined way. Through prayer, fasting, and even breathing exercises, the Jews would look for insightful revelations on who God is to help better understand God's promises, his directives, and his rescue plan. And all of these practices would be focused on the Old Testament scriptures. Remember, for Saul, Israel's history was his own history. Its story was his story. The story of Abraham and the burning cooking pot as it swung between the halves of sacrificial animals, Moses and the burning bush, Jacob wrestling with God, and his own dreams of a ladder reaching down from heaven to earth. Joseph interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh, and of course Daniel interpreting the dreams of the pagan Babylonian kings, along with his own revelations. All having a vision of heaven and earth in dangerous but glorious interchange. N.T. Wright points out how this would have set the stage for Saul and for other first-century disciplined Jews for their own prayer life and understanding of their own part in Israel's history. Wright writes, "We are trying to think our way into the mind of a zealous young Jew determined to do God's will whatever it cost, eager to purge Israel from idolatry and sin, keen to hasten the time when God would come back and rule his world with justice and righteousness. What could be more appropriate than for such a young man to seek through prayer and meditation to inhabit for himself those strange old traditions of heaven and earth commerce, to become in his own mind and heart, and perhaps even body, part of that heaven and earth reality, a visionary whose inner eye and perhaps also whose outer eye might glimpse the ultimate mystery." Wright then goes on to share a popular first century Jewish prayer and meditation practice, one that was focused on Ezekiel's great vision of the heavenly throne room, where the one God sits. Now, Wright supposes that this vision would have been on Saul's mind at the time of his conversion. This is, of course, just a guess, and N.T. Wright admits this. We have no record of what specifically was on Saul's mind on his road to Damascus. But Wright points out that this would have been a common practice for the Jews of the first century, especially one such as Saul, and that it would have been a common practice when on the long road traveling. The important point is not whether or not he was specifically thinking on this passage, but that this Old Testament story directly connects what it is that Paul realizes during his conversion. During this popular meditation practice, one would patiently contemplate in detail on Ezekiel's meditation. First on the whirling and flashing four-faced creatures, then slowly he would move up to the whirling wheels and then to the throne itself, thinking through every detail of his heavenly throne room, a connection of heaven and earth, and then onto the throne itself, and then onto the figure sitting on the throne, described as something that seemed like human form. And remembering how the prophet Ezekiel then falls on his face before receiving his vocation as a prophet of God. You can imagine Saul, head full of scripture, heart full of zeal, slowly contemplating this passage on the road to Damascus. Wright poetically paints his conversion in this way. He is seeing now, eyes wide open, conscious of being wide awake, but conscious also that there seems to be a rift in reality, a fissure in the fabric of the cosmos, and that his waking eyes are seeing things so dangerous that if he were not so prepared, so purified, so carefully devout, he would never have dared to come this far. Upward again, from the chest to the face of the figure on the throne. He raises his eyes to see the one he has worshipped and served all his life, and he comes face to face with Jesus of Nazareth. This moment blindingly both shattered and fulfilled Saul's wildest hopes and dreams. In that moment, he saw that Jesus was the figure in human form, sitting on the throne room in Ezekiel's vision, the fulfillment of Israel's ancient scriptures, the fulfillment of Israel's hope. God the Creator had raised Jesus from the dead, declaring not only that he really was Israel's Messiah, but that he had done what the one God had promised to do himself in person. Wright points out that Saul had been absolutely right in his devotion to the one true God, but absolutely wrong in his understanding of who that one God was, and how his purposes would ultimately be fulfilled. Here is the heart of the conversion story. It has nothing to do with Saul, and everything to do with God and his Messiah, his rescue plan for Israel and for the world. Saul lived a life of hope, practiced hope of a rescue plan for his people. He also lived in constant contemplation and anticipation of a renewal of the temple, the place where heaven and earth come together so that God can dwell with his people. And suddenly, he sees that the forgiveness that Israel needs and the rescue from exile is found in the crucified and risen Jesus Christ. That the temple was no longer a place built by hands, but was found in the very body and blood of Jesus Christ. Heaven and earth had come together in the living temple, Jesus of Nazareth. This realization was his conversion. And understanding his conversion is essential to understanding his life, his ministry, and his writings. And here we must touch on an essential, but maybe difficult to understand term: which is conversion. When we think of conversion, we normally think of a change from one religion to a different religion, almost like if a person was converted from, say, atheism to Christianity. In the example of an atheist converting to Christianity, one might reject most of what they had previously believed for a whole new thought process. They might repent of their belief that there wasn't a God. They might rethink everything that they thought about morality and relationship and forgiveness and the meaning behind things. There would be a complete change of thought. However, this is not what happened with Paul. Paul did not for a second cease to believe in the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nor did he reject the ancestral ways of Israel, the Torah, the law, the prophets, the scriptures. Rather, Paul found a newfound appreciation for all of these things. Saul was not converted from a religion of Judaism to a religion of Christianity. Rather, he understood Christ as the fulfillment of all that Judaism anticipated. He saw Jesus as the point at which, exactly as the martyr Stephen had claimed, heaven and earth were now fused together. It was about Jesus as being in person, the reality towards which the temple had always pointed. And the important takeaway is this: Christians did not come about teaching a new religion that competed with Judaism. Rather, they confessed that Jesus was the Messiah anticipated by all of the Jewish scriptures. Not a new religion, but a fulfillment of all things. Wright summarizes this important point this way: Paul remained to his dying day fiercely loyal to Israel's God, seen in fresh and blinding focus in Jesus. Neither Paul nor his communities were engaged in comparative religion. They were not saying, we've tried one way of being religious, and now we think we have a better one. Nobody thought like that in the first century, certainly no Jew. They were focused on what we might call messianic eschatology, the belief that the one God had acted climactically and decisively in and even as Israel's Messiah, a shocking, blinding reality, the reality that would change the world. So where does this leave us? Well, once again, it really leaves us at the beginning. All of this sets the stage for the life, ministry, and writings of Saul that has shaped our world, our church, and our faith. Saul was immediately baptized and brought into the family of Christian believers, his loyalty resting fully in God's own Son and Messiah, Jesus. His prayer life continued, but with a new focus. He now saw who sat on the throne. Saul, or can we now say Paul, was now a Messiah man, whose life was shaped by Jesus of Nazareth, who had summed up the divine purpose of Israel. And so, away he went. But first to Arabia and then back home to Tarsus. But why Arabia? Well, we'll take a look at Paul's first moves as a follower of Jesus and how those first moves really demonstrate both his understanding of his own calling and his deep understanding of how Jesus is the fulfillment of all that the scriptures and the world has anticipated. And we'll continue that study on Thursday. So thank you for joining me for chapter 3 here in our study on Paul the Apostle. I hope you and your family are doing well. God bless and take care.